We often believe that the lives of global icons are entirely transparent, documented by every camera and headline. We track their triumphs and their public failures, assuming that the person we see on screen is the person who exists behind closed doors. But history shows that even the most exposed individuals can maintain a clinical level of deception. For some of the most celebrated figures in British history, the ultimate secret was not hidden wealth or a political scandal. It was a hidden family. Behind the carefully managed personas of the solitary artist or the eternal bachelor, these stars were navigating a complex reality of unacknowledged sons and daughters kept in the shadows to preserve a manufactured image. These are not mere rumors. They are documented cases of long-term secrecy, where paternity tests, non-disclosure agreements, and international borders were used to keep bloodlines off the record. From the kings of the stage to the icons of the silver screen, we are examining the strategic silence maintained by 15 legends. Today, we expose the private lives and the secret children of the stars who lived a double life. And number one is Hugh Grant. Hugh Grant was famously known as the world's most committed bachelor, a man who seemed to avoid domestic life at all costs. However, behind the scenes, Grant was quietly building a massive family in a way that defied every Hollywood convention. Between 2011 and 2012, Grant fathered 3 children within just 15 months with 2 different partners. The timeline was so overlapping and complex that it required a clinical level of coordination to keep the details away from the British press. For years, the public was led to believe that Grant was living a solitary playboy lifestyle. In reality, he was shuttling between 2 different households in London, maintaining a double life that few could have sustained. He managed to keep the arrival of his sons and daughters a secret by using private hospitals and strict non-disclosure agreements, ensuring that the true scale of his fatherhood remained a mystery to his fans. The conflict erupted when the media finally unearthed the birth records, revealing that Grant had become a father multiple times over in a shockingly short period. The revelation shattered his eternal bachelor image and exposed a man who was deeply protective of his private reality. He was not just a father. He was a man who had successfully manipulated the media narrative to hide the existence of his growing bloodline. Today, Grant is more open about his family, but the clinical secrecy of those early years remains a fascination. He proved that even in the age of 24-hour paparazzi, it is possible to hide an entire family if you have the resources and the will to stay silent. His story is the ultimate modern example of how a star can maintain a secret domestic life right under the nose of the public. And number 2 is Liam Gallagher. Liam Gallagher defined the rock and roll lifestyle of the 90s, but one of the darkest chapters of his era involved a daughter he refused to acknowledge for 2 decades. In 1998, just months after marrying his first wife, Gallagher had a secret affair that resulted in the birth of a daughter named Molly Moysh. While he provided financial support under a clinical legal agreement, he made it clear that he wanted no personal involvement in the child's life. For 20 years, Gallagher lived a life where Molly simply did not exist in his public or private world. He ignored her existence in interviews and avoided any form of contact, leaving her to grow up watching her father's fame from a distance. It was a cold-blooded separation that lasted through his various marriages and his rise to global stardom. He had effectively erased a part of his own bloodline to suit his lifestyle. The conflict was a source of constant media speculation as Molly's mother spoke out about the emotional toll of Gallagher's silence. Despite the public pressure, Liam remained immovable, proving that his tough guy persona extended to his domestic choices. He lived a double life as a national hero to millions of Oasis fans while being a complete stranger to his firstborn daughter. In 2018, the two finally met. But the clinical reality of 20 years of abandonment cannot be easily undone. Gallagher proved that even the most famous people can harbor a secret child in plain sight for decades. His story is a study in how fame can be used as a shield to ignore the most basic responsibilities of fatherhood. And number 3 is Tom Jones. Tom Jones has always been celebrated for his powerful voice and his sex symbol image. But a 1987 affair led to a paternity scandal that he has spent decades trying to ignore. After a brief encounter in New York, a woman named Catherine Berkery gave birth to a son, Jonathan. Jones initially denied any connection, forcing a clinical legal battle that culminated in a paternity test that proved beyond any doubt that he was the father. Despite the legal ruling and the court-ordered child support, Jones made a clinical decision to never meet his son. For over 30 years, Jonathan Berkery has lived in the shadow of a father who acknowledges his existence on a legal document but refuses to see him in person. Jones maintained a double life where he sang about love and family to global audiences while maintaining an absolute cold wall between himself and his American son. The conflict became a recurring headline as Jonathan grew up, eventually facing periods of homelessness and struggle. While his father sat on a multi-million-dollar fortune, Jones has remained famously silent on the matter, proving a level of emotional detachment that shocked many of his longtime fans. He chose to protect his public brand and his marriage over the needs of a child he viewed as a professional liability. His story is one of the most chilling examples of how fame can result in a total lack of empathy. Jones proved that a legal victory in a paternity suit does not guarantee a relationship. He remains a legend of the stage, but his refusal to acknowledge his secret son in any meaningful way is a permanent stain on his personal legacy. At number 4 is Albert Finney. Albert Finney was a titan of the British stage and screen, a man whose intense privacy was legendary. Early in his career, he fathered a son, Simon, during a brief marriage that ended as his fame began to skyrocket. Rather than incorporating his son into his new world of Hollywood success, Finney chose to maintain a clinical separation between his professional life and his firstborn child. For decades, the existence of his son was rarely mentioned in interviews or biographies. Finney lived a double life where he was worshipped as one of the greatest actors of his generation, while his son lived a quiet, unremarkable life far away from the spotlight. He built a wall around his domestic history that was so thick that many of his fans believed he had no children at all. The conflict was the total erasure of his early family life to suit the image of a focused, solitary artist. Finney was not interested in the family man narrative that the press often demanded of stars. He proved that it is possible to remain a leading man for 50 years without ever letting the public see the reality of your first family. It was a calculated move to protect his son from the toxicity of fame, but also resulted in a lifetime of secrecy. When Finney passed away, the world was reminded of the son he had kept in the shadows. He proved that in the world of British acting, privacy is the ultimate currency. His story is a reminder that the most authentic actors are often the ones who are hiding the most significant parts of their reality from the gaze of the world. At number 5 is Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was a man of 1,000 voices, but his real-world identity was a chaotic mess of fractured relationships and hidden connections. While he had children from his official marriages, his private life involved several unofficial family ties and domestic arrangements that he went to extreme lengths to keep secret. He lived in a state of clinical paranoia, fearing that any revelation about his private life would dismantle his comedic brand. Sellers was known for his coldness toward his acknowledged children, but it was the connections he did not acknowledge that caused the most controversy. He maintained a series of secret relationships that resulted in domestic entanglements he refused to clarify. He lived a double life where he was the world's most beloved comedian, while his private reality was defined by a total lack of emotional stability and hidden family dramas. The conflict only became clear after his death in 1980, when the settling of his estate revealed a web of complicated family claims and fractured bonds. The man who could play any character was unable to maintain a single honest family life. He had spent years in emotional manipulation while keeping other parts of his life entirely in the dark. His legacy is one of genius, but his history as a father is a clinical study in dysfunction. Sellers proved that you can make the whole world laugh while leaving your own children in a state of emotional and financial confusion. His story is a reminder that the most brilliant performers are often the ones who are least capable of handling the simple reality of family. At number 6 is Daniel Day-Lewis. Daniel Day-Lewis is known for his extreme commitment to his craft, but he applied that same intensity to keeping his first son hidden from the British media. In the early 1990s, he had a son, Gabriel Kane, with a French actress during a high-profile relationship. However, as the relationship collapsed, Day-Lewis retreated into a clinical shell of privacy, ensuring that his son's upbringing in France remained a total secret from the UK press for years. For a significant period, the British public was entirely unaware that the man who was winning Oscars was a father to a young son across the channel. Day-Lewis lived a double life, where he moved between intense film sets and a hidden domestic reality in Europe. He refused to allow his son to be used as a prop for his fame, maintaining a total blackout on Gabriel Kane's existence until he was nearly a teenager. The conflict arose from his desire for total control over his narrative. Day-Lewis has always viewed the media as an enemy, and he treated the existence of his son as a sensitive secret. He proved that even in an era of global interconnectedness, a star can keep a child off the grid if they are willing to disappear from public life for years at a time. His son eventually entered the public eye as a model and musician, but the years of hidden fatherhood remain a testament to Day-Lewis's uncompromising nature. He proved that for some stars, the greatest performance is the one where the world does not even know you have a child. His story is the definitive study in how method acting extends to a star's commitment to secrecy. At number 7 is Denholm Elliott. Denholm Elliott was the quintessential English gentleman of the screen, but his private life was a masterclass in clinical deception. Behind the respectable image of the character actor lay a web of secret domestic arrangements and children from various unions that were never discussed in the press. He lived a double life where his public persona was built on reliability and tradition, while his private reality was a series of hidden lives. Elliott understood that in the conservative world of the 1960s and 70s, his unofficial family connections could be a professional liability. He maintained a clinical separation between his various households, ensuring that the children from his secret lives never crossed paths with his professional image. He was a man who managed his secrets with the same precision he brought to his acting, leaving the public entirely in the dark. The conflict was the emotional cost of this secrecy on the children involved. They grew up in a world where their father was a famous face they could only claim in private. Elliott proved that a star can maintain multiple families if they are willing to live in a state of permanent omission. He chose the safety of his career over the transparency required for a real family bond. His secrets only began to unravel toward the end of his life, revealing a man who had been a stranger to his own public image. He proved that the proper British actor is often the one with the most complicated hidden history. Elliott's story is a reminder that the most stable-looking stars are often the ones hiding the most children in the shadows. At number 8 is Brian Blessed. Brian Blessed is known for his booming voice and larger-than-life personality, but he kept one of the biggest secrets of his life hidden for decades. Only later in his career did it emerge that he had a daughter from a previous relationship during his early years in the industry. This was not a minor detail. It was a total erasure of a human being from his public biography for almost 40 years. Blessed lived a double life where he was the adventurous, outspoken star who shared every detail of his mountain climbs and acting roles while remaining clinically silent about his first child. He managed to keep his fans entirely unaware of this part of his history, creating a narrative that focused solely on his later, more acceptable family life. He proved that a loud voice can be used to distract people from the secrets you do not want them to hear. The conflict was the shock felt by his audience when the truth finally surfaced. The image of the jolly giant was suddenly complicated by the reality of a daughter who had been kept in a state of professional and public non-existence. Blessed had successfully navigated the industry for decades without ever letting the secret slip, showing a clinical level of control over his past. His story is a reminder that even the most open stars are often hiding something significant. He proved that you can be a household name while keeping your own flesh and blood a secret. Bless History of Hidden Fatherhood is a study in how a star can rewrite their own life story to exclude the parts that do not fit the current brand. At number 9 is Rex Harrison. Rex Harrison was the legendary star of My Fair Lady, but his reputation as a sophisticated gentleman was built on a foundation of clinical abandonment. Harrison was married 6 times and had a habit of ignoring or hiding the children from his earlier unions to prioritize his current lifestyle and image. He viewed his children not as a legacy, but as inconveniences that threatened to complicate his leading man status in Hollywood. He lived a double life where he was the height of charm on screen while being a cold, distant figure to the children he kept in the shadows. Harrison frequently moved between countries to avoid the responsibilities of his previous families, using his fame and wealth to maintain a clinical distance. He was a man who believed that his only duty was to his career and his current wife, leaving his secret children to fend for themselves. The conflict was the trail of broken bonds and emotional wreckage he left behind. His children often spoke of a man they did not know, a star who was too focused on his own reflection to acknowledge his sons and daughters. He proved that in the golden age of Hollywood, a star could effectively delete a family and start over without the press asking too many questions. Harrison died a legend, but his history as a father is one of the darkest in show business. He proved that you can win an Oscar while failing the most basic test of humanity. His story is a reminder that the most polished icons are often the ones who have discarded the most people on their way to the top. At number 10 is Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor's life was an open book, but she applied a clinical level of secrecy to the private struggles and hidden lives of her children. While she was the most photographed woman in the world, she went to extreme lengths to hide certain family realities from the paparazzi. She understood that her children were targets, and she used her massive power to ensure that their secret struggles and private relationships stayed out of the tabloids. She lived a double life, where she was the ultimate movie star, while privately operating a sophisticated security apparatus to protect her offspring. Taylor was known to buy off journalists and use her influence with studio heads to suppress stories that threatened her children's privacy. She proved that a star can hide the truth about their family if they are willing to fight the media on their own terms. The conflict was the constant pressure of being a Taylor child. They lived in a world where their every move was a potential headline, and their mother's protection often felt like a cage of secrecy. She chose to keep their lives hidden to prevent them from being consumed by the same fame that had defined her own existence. Taylor's legacy is one of strength, but her commitment to keeping her family's secrets is a hidden part of her story. She proved that the most famous woman in the world could still keep a part of her heart off limits to the public. Her story is a reminder that behind the diamonds and the scandals was a woman who treated her family's privacy as a matter of life and death. At number 11 is George Sanders. George Sanders was the personification of the cynical, sophisticated aristocrat, a man whose high-status screen persona suggested a life of detached luxury. However, behind this mask of world-weary charm was a man who maintained a clinical isolation regarding his domestic life. He lived a double life where he mocked the world and its social conventions in his films while privately constructing a rigid wall between his professional world and the children he kept entirely removed from the Hollywood machinery. He was a man who viewed the film industry as a toxic environment and made a calculated decision to ensure his family remained untainted by the phoniness of his work. The depth of his secrecy was a reflection of his own deep-seated disillusionment with fame. Sanders understood that the media would attempt to turn his children into commodities, and he exerted absolute control to prevent this from happening. He operated with a clinical precision, ensuring that his family's reality was never used to shape his public narrative. He lived a life of total professional commitment, while his children were raised in an environment that was surgically separated from the gossip and the cameras of the studio system. The conflict lay in the total emotional distance he maintained to protect this secrecy, because he never discussed his family or allowed them to be part of the Hollywood social circuit. Many in the industry believed he was as cold and childless in reality as the characters he played. He proved that a star can be a household name while keeping their most significant personal bonds entirely off the grid. This was not a move born out of shame, but a strategic effort to protect his offspring from the very machine that funded his lifestyle. Throughout his career, Sanders managed his domestic arrangements with a level of silence that was rare, even in the more private era of the 1950s. He refused to sell the family man image that studio PR departments often demanded, choosing instead to be seen as a solitary, cynical figure. He understood that in Hollywood, your private life is only safe if it is invisible, and he proved that a star can maintain a secret sanctuary if they are willing to be perceived as unreachable by the public. His story is a reminder that the most authentic performances are often the ones used to hide a very different private truth. Sanders proved that you can have a long, successful career without ever sacrificing your family's privacy for a headline. When he eventually departed from the world, he left behind a legacy of brilliant acting. But the true nature of his domestic life and his role as a father remained a clinical mystery, a final act of defiance against a world that demands to know everything. At number 12 is Vivien Leigh. Vivien Leigh became a global phenomenon as Scarlett O'Hara. But her rapid ascent to the heights of Hollywood stardom resulted in a clinical minimization of her first family. Before she was an international icon, she had a daughter, Suzanne, from her first marriage to Lee Holman, a part of her history that she quickly left behind to pursue her ambitions. To maintain the image of the young, unattached starlet that the public craved, both the studio and Leigh herself ensured that her relationship with her daughter was kept almost entirely out of the professional spotlight. She lived a double life where she was the most famous and desired woman in the world, while her daughter was raised by her father and grandmother, far removed from the glamour of London and Los Angeles. Leigh's contact with Suzanne was managed with a clinical detachment as the pressures of her career and her legendary high-profile relationship with Laurence Olivier took priority over her maternal responsibilities. She proved that the price of becoming a permanent cinematic legend is often the strategic abandonment of a previous, more grounded life. The conflict was the emotional chasm that defined her relationship with her daughter for decades. Suzanne was effectively the secret child of a woman who was too consumed by the weight of being a legend to function as a mother in the traditional sense. Leigh chose the intense glare of the spotlight over the domestic reality of her first household, proving that in the 1930s and 1940s, a female star's past was often viewed as a professional liability that needed to be surgically hidden from the fan magazines. Leigh's life was a cycle of extreme highs and devastating lows. Yet, her role as a mother remained the most suppressed chapter of her public biography. She operated under a clinical understanding that the public wanted to see her as a tragic romantic figure, not a mother with domestic ties to a former husband. She used the complexity of her career and her mental health struggles as a shield, ensuring that the reality of her daughter's existence never complicated the carefully constructed narrative of her life with Olivier. Ultimately, her legacy is defined by her brilliance and her tragic beauty. But her history as a mother remains a cold, overlooked fact. She proved that fame can act as a permanent wall between a parent and a child, especially when the industry demands a certain type of image. Her story is a clinical reminder that the most romantic icons in history are often the ones who have made the most calculated and difficult sacrifices in their private lives to stay at the top. At number 13 is Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier was the king of the British stage, but his relationship with his first son, Tarquin, was a masterclass in clinical distance. During his high-profile marriage to Vivien Leigh and his subsequent rise to high prestige status, Olivier effectively hid the reality of his fractured bond with his son from the press. He lived a double life where he was the pillar of the establishment while privately being a cold, unreachable father to his firstborn. Olivier treated his domestic failings as professional embarrassments that needed to be managed. He maintained a clinical separation between his new family and the son from his first marriage, ensuring that Tarquin remained a background figure in his life story. He proved that a man can be the greatest actor in the world while being entirely incapable of managing the simple truth of a broken family. The conflict was the public image of the perfect theatrical dynasty that Olivier worked so hard to maintain. Behind the scenes, his son was a living reminder of a life Olivier had moved on from. He hounded his son with a lack of attention and a clinical focus on his own career, proving that for Olivier, the only thing that mattered was his place in history. He died a knighted legend, but the story of his secret son is a dark part of his legacy. He proved that you could be the voice of Shakespeare while being a stranger to your own son. Olivier's story is a reminder that the most noble figures in show business are often the ones hiding the most clinical domestic failures. At number 14 is Charles Laughton. Charles Laughton was a giant of the screen, but the nature of his private life meant that any mention of children or domestic reality was a forbidden topic within the studio system. He lived a double life where his marriage was a professional arrangement designed to protect his career, and the talk of a family was treated with clinical silence. He proved that in the early years of Hollywood, a star's domestic reality could be entirely fabricated for the public. Laughton understood that his survival in the industry depended on maintaining a certain image, and that image did not include the reality of his private domestic situation. He lived in a state of clinical secrecy, ensuring that the studio executives kept his personal life out of the fan magazines. He was a man who became a legend while keeping his true self entirely off limits to his audience. The conflict was the total omission of his personal truth from his public legacy. He proved that a star can exist as a character for their entire life with no one ever knowing the reality of their home. He chose to live in the shadows to protect his ability to work, proving that for some performers, the only way to have a career was to have no public family at all. His story is the final word on the secret children era. He represents a time when the studio controlled every aspect of a star's life, including the children they were allowed or not allowed to have. Laughton's history is a clinical look at the total control of the industry over the private lives of its legends. At number 15 is Michael Wilding. Michael Wilding was a top-tier leading man, but his children were often treated as clinical assets to be moved across borders to avoid the media. During his high-profile marriages to stars like Elizabeth Taylor, Wilding ensured that his children were kept in a state of hidden domesticity, often being raised in different countries to keep them away from the prying eyes of the paparazzi. He lived a double life where he was a Hollywood star while his children were living quiet lives far from the cameras. He understood that his children's presence could complicate his image as a romantic lead, and he used his resources to maintain a clinical distance between his fame and his family. He proved that a star can hide their children in plain sight by simply moving them away from the centers of power. He was a man who prioritized his public status over the visibility of his family. The conflict was the sense of displacement felt by his children, who were moved like pieces on a chessboard to protect their father's career. Wilding lived through a period where his children were secret only in the sense that they were never allowed to be part of his professional world. He chose to keep them hidden to ensure that his own fame remained untainted by the realities of fatherhood. He died having lived a life of glamour, but the story of his children is one of clinical separation. He proved that in the world of high-profile celebrity, a family can be an obstacle to be managed. Wilding's history of hidden children is a final reminder that the most glamorous lives are often the ones where the family is kept the furthest away from the light.